Yesterday, I posted a video talking about the evolution of evangelical orthodoxy because people often have the mistaken idea that orthodoxy is just some fixed thing that it never changes. And in fact, that just ain't true. Orthodoxy, in its practical expression, is always shifting, always changing. Is changing in terms of the live options. So, what are considered to be doctrines that one can legitimately hold or not hold as a Christian, or more specifically, as an evangelical Christian, as was the context of my video? That is always shifting. And so, I noted that. So, if you go back to the 70s and 80s, the only view that was considered generally legitimate for an evangelical to hold, or only view that was considered orthodox for an evangelical to hold, was the concept of hell as being eternal conscious torment. But throughout the 1980s into the early 90s and mid 90s, that began to shift, and increasingly evangelicals were recognizing you could also hold to another view, which is annihilation as a view of posthumous judgment. The idea that you are people who are unregenerate or outside Christ are resurrected to a punishment that results in the cessation of their existence or their complete destruction. And then it's continued to shift. And what's even more interesting, perhaps, is that in the last 15, 20 years, you've seen an increasing shift among evangelicals toward universalism. And I gave specific examples like Robin Perry and the publication in the Zondernet Van Counterpoint series in 2016 of a book on posthumous judgment or hell, which included universalism as one of the options. Now, the framework that I kind of used to discuss this shifting view of universalism was this launching point was this tweet from John Piper criticizing Rob Bell, where he said, "Farewell, Rob Bell," with the publication of his book, Love Wins, and a link to a Desiring God Ministries review. And of course, I cheekily put Love Wins over the tweet because Piper's word, in fact, was not the last word. And this self appointed Pope did not actually decide the fate of posthumous judgment. Now, the video was met with widespread acclaim. Well, maybe not universal acclaim, though. For example, here's one fellow who commented in response to my video. His name's Ian. Ian says, "I suggest you do your research on people before criticizing them. You keep making this mistake." In Canada, we have a response to that. We say, "Okay, buddy." Anyway, Ian continues. He says, "Piper did not say that because of Rob Bell's universalism. It was because he saw him as mocking penal substitution." Here's a quote from him. Quote, "When I watched the video of Rob Bell that was put up on Justin Taylor's website, my issue there was not primarily his view of hell. It was his cynicism concerning the cross of Jesus Christ as a place where the Father atoned for the sins of his children and dealt with his own wrath by punishing me in his Son. I consider that the essence of the cross and my salvation the heart of God for me, and that ticked me off royally. I didn't say all that, so probably everybody thought Farewell Rob Bell was kind of like, I don't like his view of hell, so there. Well, I don't like John Stott's view of hell either, and I never said anything about John Stott. I kept learning from John Stott." Unquote. Oh, there's a lot here. First of all, I do find it interesting that Ian chides me for failing to research the tweet. Let's take a look at Piper's comments here. So the first thing to note is this. He admits here, like he condemned Rob Bell to the hinterland. He said, "Farewell, Rob Bell," not because he'd read Love Wins and processed it charitably, but because he watched a short video. And that short video alone was enough for him to condemn the book. I wonder if Piper would think that's a very charitable way to engage with him. So if he does a 3-minute video on something, you don't need to read his 250-page book because you've got the 2 3-minute video. But then he says, "My issue was not primarily his view of hell." Note that he doesn't say universalism was not a factor here. It was not the primary factor. So already Ian's misrepresenting Piper. Piper doesn't say that universalism wasn't a factor here. Um, so then he says it was Rob Bell's cynicism. And he goes on and talks about how he was offended that Rob Bell rejected penal substitution. Everything I said here about Piper being a theological bully stays. Nothing changes. It's incredible to me. Here you have Piper admitting it's it's not only about penal substitution, but penal substitution was a key factor for him here. I have news for you, John Piper, and all of your Piperettes. Penal substitution is not the gospel. It is your theological interpretation, your theory of the atonement. The church, writ large, orthodoxy with a small o, has never had any single theory of atonement as part of the package of Orthodox Christian confession. It is a shock for people who are raised drinking from the fountain of John Piper to learn something like that. But Piper has conflated his theory of the atonement with the doctrine of reconciliation and restoration itself. And that is a critical error to make. You go back, of course, to the early century of the church, you had accounts like Christus Victor and Ransom. You had recapitulation account of atonement. You've had satisfaction theory of atonement, which is not the same thing as a penal substitutionary theory of atonement. More recently, have had things like governmental theory of atonement, Girardian theory of atonement, moral exemplar theory of atonement, and kaleidoscopic theory of atonement, healer theory of atonement. I could go on. There are several other theories of atonement. None of them is the gospel. But Piper has conflated his understanding of the gospel, his theoretical interpretation of the gospel itself. So if you reject penal substitution, you have rejected God. And that's why here he's expelling uh, Rob Bell from the kingdom. Note as well that he assumes that a critique of penal substitution is cynicism about substitution. Well, we could talk, I guess, about what that exactly means, but I think anybody who considers penal substitution should be cynical. It's a ghastly account, an account where this is the old model in the South Pacific where you need to throw a virgin sacrifice into the volcano every year to placate the volcano god. That's the kind of theology of penal substitution, where God needs a sacrifice in order to placate God's wrath against sinners. So that's the first part. God needs blood. He needs to kill something in order to be satisfied in his wrath. And then the next part of penal substitution is the way that God then placates his wrath is by killing an aspect of himself, namely the son. Uh, and so he kills and tortures and kills the son because it's not just a momentary execution; it's an extended period of torture followed by cessation of existence or death. He tortures the son for an extended period and finally kills the son, and then at last the father's wrath is satisfied against human sinners because he has killed his own son. That is the account of reconciliation that I guess Ian thinks is an appealing account. Here's one of the things. Well, I mean, there's so much, of course, to be said here. And let me just note that I'll give you one other example about the whole problem of the concept of the imputation of guilt. Because people often, when they're defending penal substitution, they want to do it in economic categories. Say, talk about, well, you have a great debt, but God took your debt and gave you money, and so you are now no longer in debt. But penal substitution is ultimately not about a transfer of debt. It is about a transfer of punishment. Again, torture and execution. So there was an instance a few years ago where a son committed a crime. This was in the news. A son committed a crime. The father learned that the son had committed the crime. I think it was like a bank robbery or something like that. And the father came forward to the district attorney and the police and said, I did it. And he actually went to prison for like 9 months until they figured out it was in fact the son who did it. And the interesting thing, lo and behold, was that the district attorney and the judge did not think justice had been done because the father agreed to impute the son's guilt to him and then go to prison in his place. Rather, they recognized justice had not been done because the wrong person was put in prison. And that's the core problem with the concept of the imputation transfer of guilt from a guilty party to an innocent party. It's not something you can pass around like that spot in the Cat in the Hat book that keeps moving around from one place to another. It's not like that. There's all sorts of problems there. And you can point those problems out without being cynical or nasty. It's just, this is a real problem, let alone the concept of the wrathful God and how that corrupts the way that people think about God. And it cultivates terror in people very often. It can be a kind of theological terrorism. And that is what John Piper, according to this passage, is saying is something that is subjects you to banishment. That if you question and criticize penal substitution, this ghastly theory of atonement that Piper holds, that is sufficient to banish you from the kingdom. Farewell, Randall Rouser. Farewell, Rob Bell. And Ian thinks, I guess, that that's a defense of John Piper. Um, okay, and then just a word about John Stott. He throws in John Stott. He says, I don't like John Stott's view of hell either, and I never said anything about Stott. Yeah, but that's a non sequitur. John Stott never defended universalism. John Stott defended annihilationism. So it's just not the same thing. So if Piper wants to uh, argue it was not at all about universalism, this comparison between John Stott and Rob Bell is a non sequitur. Another thing I would just note about John Stott is John Stott was very measured. In the book Evangelical Essentials, co-written with David Edwards in 1988, that's the book where there's a few pages in there that Stott talks about annihilationism as a possibility, and he doesn't endorse it strongly in anything like the way Clark Pinnock did in the book Four Views of Health that I talked about in the previous video. So that's also misleading. So yeah, Ian says I haven't researched the tweet. Be that as it may. I want to take one. I'll look at one more thing quickly before we wrap up. Uh, so the last thing, I just want to say a word about the way that Piper has engaged with universalism in the past, because it's pretty consistently terrible. And this is an example of it. So this is from 2023, I believe, on Desiring God Ministries. This is like a Bible study, I guess, from Piper. And this is part two of his exposition of reconciliation of all things in Colossians 1:19 and 20. And so you can watch that here if you want. What's interesting about this is, well, some of the things interesting about it. First of all, something I've talked about before in this YouTube channel is I pointed out that when people do systematic theology, you are always selecting particular biblical passages as what are called control texts. And those become the framework of interpretation for other passages. It's just a type of theorization. Just like in any theory, a theory is an overarching interpretive framework of data. And within a theory, the framework has certain touch points of interpretation for other um, other data that has to be interpreted within the theory. And that's what's happening here is that Piper comes to a passage which, by a natural reading, this poem that Paul is quoting here includes, I believe he's quoting like an early creedal form of the church, early hymn of the church. It's a very common view among New Testament scholars from Colossians 1:15 to 20 that this culminates in what appears to be an account of universal restoration of all things, whether things in heaven or things on earth, having peace through the blood of Christ. And that, at first blush, is a universalist passage. If you were a universalist, this would be a passage that you would use likely, among others, as an interpretive framework for other passages. What Piper does is exactly the opposite. He already has his account of eternal conscious torment, and in this passage, he does his best, I'm going to say, in my humble opinion, to fit a square peg into a round hole and argue that this is really about um, consistent with eternal conscious torment and that doesn't teach universalism at all. So you can listen for yourself and see whether you think that to be persuasive. But the way he talks about he just speculates on demons existing in certain enclaves in heaven, a very sort of mythological view, and how the blood of Christ is neutralizing their presence in heaven as a way to try to explain what's going on in this passage. I find it quite odd. But the other thing I wanted to note about this little exposition before we conclude is that Piper misrepresents, baldly misrepresents universalism. He says universalism is the view that there is no hell at all in the afterlife, there is no judgment at all, which of course is flatly false. Christian universalism is the idea that there is a judgment, a posthumous judgment, but that it is restorative, similar to purgatory. The other thing to note is that he then contradicts himself in this video, this reconciliation of all things by blood teaching section. He contradicts himself by proposing the possibility that hell could consist of a period of posthumous judgment, ultimately leading to restoration. And then he contradicts himself again by saying the view of universalism is that there is no punishment at all. So he's all over the place, strawmanning, caricaturing, misrepresenting what universalists believe. It's not a good look for John Piper. To conclude, anyway, so Ian says I didn't research the tweet. I think what I've demonstrated here is that there is, first of all, everybody has a theory, and Piper has a theory, and I think that actually Piper does violence to biblical texts. I think that his theory of penal substitution is indeed ghastly and has very bad theological implications for how we think about justice and how we think about the love and justice of God.